Hello and welcome. I'm Paul from Garden Well Eat Well. Today I'm planting beans and I'm using my own seed that I harvested last year. You can only do that when you plant open pollinated or heirloom varieties, because each generation will pass along the same characteristics. You can't do that with hybrid seed. But what I really want to show you is how I first test that seed and get them started before they even go in the ground. You always hope that everything you plant will grow and all your rows are full without any gaps. And for beans, this method will absolutely guarantee that. Let me show you how. Every season, I always make a point of growing both bush beans and pole beans. They're both very easy to grow and they make for a good combination too, because I can usually start picking early with the bush beans. And then later on I can get an even larger harvest from the pole beans, and that continues right up until frost. Now, pole beans do need a little extra care, only in that you need to make a trellis for them to grow on. But once they get going, their tendrils will climb very quickly, sometimes several inches a day. They'll grow 10 feet high if you want, but then you need a ladder to pick them. So I only set my trellises to be as high as I can reach. They're great because you can get a lot more beans with just a fraction of the garden space. Plus, you only have to plant them once in the spring to be able to pick them all season long. If you want to eat bush beans throughout the summer, then you really need to plant them every 2 to 3 weeks so you'll have that constant supply. But before we get to actually planting, I first want to talk a little about collecting that seed, because that's very important. To get good germination, we always have to start with dry, healthy seed. And for both bush beans and pole beans, you first want to wait for the pods to fully ripen and the seeds inside to form, and then give them all the time they need to completely dry out. I find it's best to let them dry outside on the plant instead of trying to do it indoors. There's less chance of them molding on you if they're left out in the sun and the wind. Just let them dry naturally. You'll know when they're done when the pods are brittle and snap when you try to bend them or pinch them. You may even be able to hear the seeds rattle around inside. And it's not just the pods, but every part of the plant is usually completely dry at this point. And even though you may have been picking them all during the season, once the leaves have dried and fallen away, it's always amazing at how many pods you missed that are still left on the vine. One thing though, watch out for any pods that are still soft and flexible, as those seeds won't be ready to store just yet. You can feel the seeds inside that have fully formed, but they still contain too much moisture. It's too early. Best to leave them for another week or so to dry. If you want to be sure, here's a quick test. You can pry open the pod a bit to take out a seed or two. The pods are a little difficult to open at this stage, and you may have to work at it a bit, but once you have a seed, gently press your thumbnail into it. A completely dry seed will be hard and you won't be able to make a mark. But if it leaves any indentation at all, then you know you have to give it some more time. Yeah, this one's definitely not ready. Waiting for the seeds to dry is always so dependent on the weather. Usually though, I don't have too much trouble with the bush beans being ready by the end of summer. I typically leave a lot of the pods to dry out for my first planting and use those for next year's seed. But since the pole beans aren't ready until the end of the season, or if you just planted them late, there's more of a chance for those to be caught with the wet stretches we get in the fall, and they'll need more time to dry out. Some years, winter arrives way too early, and I end up waiting until December for them to dry out to pick. It's not so much the cold that will affect your seed, but it's the lingering moisture. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that if the pod has a lot of trouble drying, then that may lead to mold or a fungus developing which can affect your seed. That's the issue. That's what you really need to be aware of. And I'll show you what that looks like. So these are pole beans, all from last year, and I collected them after we had a very wet fall. They took quite a while to dry. That's one of the reasons why the pods have so many blemishes. Normally, the pods are thick and plump, and you can tell when they're full of seed. And it's okay for the skin to have a few dark spots. It's just part of the process as the pods decay while the seeds form. But when you have large black patches or pods that are thin and shriveled and completely discolored, that's usually due to a mold. And that can affect the seed like this. This seed is supposed to be bright white. Instead, it's turned to a light brown. There's definitely a mold problem here, and I wouldn't use the seed from this pod. It doesn't mean that you should toss out all the pods. They don't ripen and dry out all at the same time, and depending on the conditions and where they grew on the trellis, each pod can be affected differently, or even not at all. So I make sure to check each one. This is better. This is what we're looking for. Nice bright white seed that practically pops out when you open them. You really just have to remove enough of the pod to reveal one of the seeds. One peek is all you need. If it's not the right color, then the rest of the pod is usually affected in the same way, and you can just toss it now. But I'll go through this whole batch and remove most of the seed that looks discolored or is malformed, because if you try planting them, they're just not going to germinate. And don't worry if you're not removing every bad seed now, because we'll catch those in the next step. So here I've just put them into a bowl. As you can see, there are a few that are definitely brown, and some that are more in the middle. They could be diseased, or maybe they're okay, but in this step, we're going to add some water, and that will help us decide. Make sure that each seed gets fully wet, and they're not just floating. You've probably heard that soaking your bean seed for 24 hours can help in germination. That may be true, but that's not what we're doing here. With this method, we're going to let the beans soak for only about 2 hours. Even if you bought your beans from a seed supplier, you can still use this technique for them too. A healthy seed that is dried properly is extremely hard and impervious to water, at least for a bit. But when it's had a difficult time drying and was affected by disease or a mold or fungus, it will not develop properly and the skin will have a lot of imperfections. That seed will quickly absorb water and will actually bloat up like we've got here. Sometimes you can see it happening in only 15 minutes. But it's not how a normal seed behaves. So now, since we can spot the larger bad seed, it's easy to separate them. A lot of them are slightly buoyant. Not all of them, but you could add some more water and try to pour them off. But I'm just going to pick them out individually, so I'm sure to get them all. And although a lot of the seed we're removing has a brownish tinge, some of them are still bright white, so this is a good way to catch those too. All the seed that's left is pretty well the same size they originally were before adding the water, but these now will have much better odds at germinating. You could just plant them at this point, but I want to go a little further. Nothing is worse than planting your seed and then finding out after 2 weeks that some seeds just weren't viable and rotted in the ground. You've wasted all that time and now you have to replant those sections. I want to ensure that every seed I plant will be guaranteed to grow. And I'll do that by forcing them to germinate now. So I've drained the water and wrapped them in some wet paper towels. That'll ensure the surface of the seed stay damp. You can keep the container covered or just leave it open to the air. Just don't let the seeds dry out. In either case, you may have to give them a spray off and on to keep them moist. So, after a few days, we've got some excellent results. We could take all these out to the garden and plant them now. I know it looks like we've got 100% germination, but it's really not. Of course, we would only plant those that have sprouted, but let me go through these to show you just how many seeds would fail if we had actually planted them originally. One thing to know, you might think a shortcut would be to just leave them soaking in water all this time, but they'll actually end up rotting on you that way. You may not realize it, but seeds need oxygen to germinate. That's why planting in wet, mucky soil can sometimes lead to a complete failure when those seeds can't breathe. In this first handful, I've got 2 seeds that didn't germinate properly. This other is just the white skin that comes off the seed as it expands, which is completely normal. Many of these actually started germinating a day or 2 ago, but you know they're healthy and ready to plant as soon as you see any sign of the root emerging. You've got time, a few days, but don't leave them in the bowl too long because they'll start growing together quickly and get all tangled up. So after separating them, we've got all these seeds that just didn't do anything. And along with those others that we had picked out earlier, it would have been really disappointing if they had all been planted. The rest here can go out in the garden and be a guaranteed success, 100%. Just plant them an inch or so deep with the root facing down. If the root is very short, like with these bush bean seeds, it's really not that critical how you plant them. They'll easily figure out which way is down. But when you've waited a bit too long, the seedlings can be fragile and you have to treat them with a little more care to get them planted. The best way I found was just to make a small trench and lay them along one side with the roots at the bottom. Then gently cover them up. In the spring when you're planting beans, that is planting from seed, the soil temperature has to be at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 Celsius. Otherwise, germination will be very slow and very poor, and they could most likely rot. But planting them once they've germinated like this avoids that trouble. You can even plant them in cooler soils this way, and they'll be fine as long as there's no chance of frost. In any case, I've always had great success planting this way. Always a full crop and no wasted space. So the next time you're growing beans, give this a try and leave me a comment if you found this method just as reliable as I have. Thanks for watching, and when you garden well, you'll always eat well.